Representatives, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen. I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate you, Mr. President, on your election as the President of the 75th Sessions of the United Nations General Assembly. I also like to thank His Excellency, Mr. Tijani Muhammad Bande, for his commitment, dedications, and leadership, and to congratulate him on successfully completing the work of the 74th session of the General Assembly, in spite of the extraordinary circumstances the world is facing due to the COVID-19 pandemic. Malaysia welcomes the theme of this year's General Assembly, "The Future We Want, United Nations We Need," reaffirming our collective commitment to multilateralism, confronting COVID-19 through effective multilateral actions. I believe the theme resonates well with each of us, appropriately framing what the world needs during a time of much uncertainty. You can be assured of Malaysia's support and cooperations in achieving the goals of these sessions of the General Assembly. Before the onset of the man's newest lethal enemy in the form of the novel coronavirus, the world had already been reeling from numerous challenges. As war continued to ravage many parts of the world, the global economic ecosystem faced unsustainable pressure as the result of trade wars and populist political posturing. Amidst all this, the state of the planet continued to suffer neglect while nations continue to bicker over who should take more responsibility to reverse the effects of climate change. All this took place against the backdrop of impoverished immigrants fleeing their homes, risking their lives by taking an arduous journey to a distant land in pursuit of a better life. Little did we know then that the COVID-19 pandemic has caused great disruption for the world. Worse still, this pandemic has affected the most vulnerable populations, women and children, people with disabilities, as well as the marginalized and the displaced. We must remember that COVID-19 does not discriminate, and because of that, our response should not too. No country has been spared. The pandemic has leveled the playing field for all nations, and the race is on to obtain a vaccine. Until or unless we obtain the antiviral medication required to treat and a vaccine to prevent this novel coronavirus, we can never fully declare victory against it. This is why the manufacturing of a vaccine must promote international collaboration rather than nationalistic competition. Saving lives should be our priority. On top of the socioeconomic impact COVID-19 has had on all of us, we need to also be mindful of the possibility of terrorism rearing its ugly head in this time of uncertainty. We must never discount the fact that terrorist groups could be ramping up their efforts to take advantage of the present uncertain times to further enhance their agenda. Transparent communication, good networking, and greater intelligence cooperation at the national and international levels are imperative to counter terrorism and radicalization during this pandemic. This is a psychological war waged on the vulnerable, and we must win over hearts and minds to succeed. Effective communication strategies at all available channels must be prioritized to ensure that misinformation and disinformation is countered without infringing respective domestic laws. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, as a measure to contain the COVID-19 pandemic, Governments are implementing lockdowns and rolling out initiatives to ensure that people do not lose their jobs and businesses do not shut down. The economic and financial impact of the pandemic has brought big and small corporations to their knees. We have witnessed how decades of hard work and dedication have been reduced to bankruptcy, or even the downsizing of companies on unimaginable scale. And this has resulted in thousands of jobs lost. And this is precisely the reason why the economic devastation of this magnitude needs the collective actions of the international community. There is a need to soften the impact to the livelihoods of all those affected. For Malaysia, the government has put in place mitigating strategies to address the socio-economic impacts that COVID-19 has had on our country. We hope Malaysia not only recovers, but emerges stronger from the pandemic. The balancing act that Malaysia strives to achieve between kick-starting our economy and implementing standard operating procedures, the SOPs, to prevent further waves of infection has been nothing short of challenging. Malaysia has put in place structural economic reforms in facing the new global landscape post-COVID-19. We have begun the implementations of economic recovery strategies, followed by an all-inclusive economic revitalization program. Even though it will take some time before we see the results, we will continue to try our level best to return to some semblance of normalcy. And we know we can only do better with the help of the international community. Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, unfortunately, the United Nations has been rather slow in aiding the response of member states to COVID-19. For instance, in the first few months of the pandemic, the United Nations Security Council, UNSC, failed to discuss the issue, even though the pandemic clearly poses a grave threat to the security of the world. Only on the 1st July of 2020 did the United Nations Security Council adopt a resolution to demand an immediate cessation of hostilities, which would allow nations to refocus resources on combating the pandemic. And this is a positive step. However, we can only imagine the benefits of such action if it had been undertaken much sooner. Differences in the Security Council left the body as it has so many times indecisive and ineffective. We must be brutally honest with ourselves and admit that after more than 7 decades, surely the fate of the world's peace and security should not continue to be left in the hands of a few. It is about time that the composition of the Security Council better reflects the United Nations' current membership. The 5 permanent seats in the Security Council reserved for the veto-wielding 5 victors of a world war has proven that the organization needs to be reformed. There would not be an alliance to pursue a common goal if one party thinks it has more right to decide than the others. Since 1946, the veto has been wielded more than 200 times. There is nothing democratic in the way the veto is used. The veto is open to abuse, be it sanctimoniously, hypocritically, to uphold wrongdoing. That is why we need to move the reform process forward. Only as an improved Security Councils and the United Nations can the world hope to see problems being addressed effectively. One of the most glaring failures of the United Nations is the situation in the occupied Palestinian territory. Despite the countless calls by the international community since the founding of the United Nations The will of the majority continues to be negated by the few. They hide their true intentions under the guise of national security and the notion of justice. Wars took place and millions lost their lives have portrayed that the very same actors caught in some of the worst tragedies have chosen to remain oblivious. For there to be lasting peace in the Middle East, the prescribed international consensus in conjunction with international law, United Nations resolutions, and the UN Charter, Israel must do several things. First, it must cease all of its illegal settlement activities. Second, it must withdraw its troops from the occupied Palestinian territory and surrounding Arab states. Third, it must allow Palestinian refugees the right to return to their land and property. Fourth, it must restore the original status of Jerusalem. And last but certainly not least, it must restore its credibility and revert to the negotiating table with Palestine. These are not new preconditions. These are merely a reflection of years of diplomatic work